without further ado, please give Patrick a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Alexander, for being a host, and Nicholas for all the hard work organising this and inviting me, so thank you very much indeed. I realise I may have tricked some of you. I am sadly no longer a young photographer, but I was once, and this is me with a bunch of kids in the Yungan caves of Shanxi province in 1986, the summer of 1986. Now, we'll see quite a lot of those kids as we progress through the photographs, but also I think the real star of the show is the camera, the Haihua camera, a twin lens Rolleiflex copy camera. You can see it pictured there. I bought that on Wanfujing High Street, which is, many of you know Beijing quite well. It's the Oxford Street of Beijing. And I'd actually broken my girlfriend at the time's camera, which was a Nikon. And I was a junior professor at Beijing Normal University, so not a huge salary. So I found a pawn shop which had this camera in the window, and I thought, well, can't afford anything else. So I bought it, and there's no light meter, no instructions. I had actually previously the worst camera in the world that my father had bought me at the age of 15, and that was a Zenith EM camera from the Soviet Union. And that camera, yeah, I don't know why I persisted with photography, because the first couple of rolls came out white, because the actual, the light meter is on top of the lens, right? So it's a cheat, the whole thing. And I was taking the light meter from the horizon and taking photographs down it. Disaster. So I'd actually learned the hard way how to do mechanical cameras. And also, actually, I'd gone down to London, because I'm from the provinces, if you like. I'm from the northwest of England. And I'd gone and spent whatever money I had to see a Bill Brandt exhibition. And Bill Brandt, those of you that are interested in photography, was photographing. He was Austrian, but he lived in England for a long time. And he was basically using very, very primitive equipment early on. So, it's not really necessarily the equipment, it's also the eye that's important. And I think what I'll do is I'll pass around the camera. Okay, so we have it here. Okay. There it is. So we'll pass it around this way, but I'll just say a couple of words about it. If there's any luck involved in this, it's because I actually was using this camera. Actually, a question I had the other day when I gave this talk in Oxford was, why were people so engaged with you? And I said, well, partly because I'm taking the picture here, and I'm talking to you, right? So it was a very passive thing. There's quite a few people. I mean, when I also gave this talk, there were some kids of 16, 17, so I did need to explain that having your photograph taken in China in 1986 was actually quite a rare thing. There were no, mobile phones or anything like that, and most people would have a camera taking a picture of them at graduation, perhaps, at marriage, perhaps. It wasn't a big deal. So, it was a big deal to have your photograph taken, and I was probably the only person doing street photography. So it's a combination of people actually being quite pleased to have their photographs taken, and also the camera itself. So I'll pass it round. And the title, Young Photographer in Beijing, is a nod to one of my many artistic influences, and that's the late, great Hedda Morrison. And her book, Photographer in Old Peking, was the only photography book available in the Friendship Store in Beijing in 1986. And that and the Nagel's Guide, which was also available in the Friendship Store. This comes from the 1960s, actually. It was compiled in the 70s, but Nagel, who was a Swiss chap, went around all of the different provinces of China, and he recorded all the historical places. And my goal was always to find the places that he didn't find, okay, one thing, or rediscover things like, and you'll see a photograph a bit later on, the Taoist temple, which had actually become paint factory number 6. So this was my equipment. Hedda Morrison in my head, and this guide, so there we are. And actually, funnily enough, the time of Hedda Morrison hadn't really changed. Beijing hadn't changed since the 1930s. There were a couple of changes which I will talk a bit more about. For instance, the wall had come down, and the moat had become Beijing number 1 metro line, which I'll talk also a little bit about. But essentially, Beijing was the same. All the hutongs were still there. You could cycle all the way around this way. So this is a very iconic map from the 1930s. And imagine that's pretty much what I was living in. Okay. Now, also, another aspect is that this is 1986. So in terms of the economic miracle, which we're all very familiar with and we've lived through, it hadn't really started. Deng Xiaoping had allowed peasants, and we'll see some photographs of that, to come into the first free markets. And the first free markets were in Beijing. So they were actually quadrupling their income. Urbanites were pretty cross, because it hadn't really changed for them. But in the photographs, you'll also see the beginnings of these changes as we go. And this is a photograph which exemplifies 9 years after the Cultural Revolution, if you like. It's taken at Beida, and I imagine that these two are actual intellectual, at least the gentleman maybe, and this is their grandchild. And the point being that I think that generation could begin to hope and to see that their grandchildren's lives were going to be markedly better than their own had been. So it was a very liminal time to be in China. This is campus life. And as for young people just finishing university, bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. But to be young was very heaven. For foreigners, being in China in 1986, and actually earlier too, was to be part of a very strange club. There were several dominant types, all of them weird. There was the leftists wanting to learn and also repatriate Maoist theories to Europe or wherever. There was the evangelical Christians keen to convert the heathen masses. And then there was the really strange and peculiar and seriously unhinged. You can guess which category I may have joined. None of them, I hope. But none of us were there for the money. And for me as a foreigner, the privilege to be in China at that time, it really was a time where I learnt my photography, because before that, film had been very expensive, but you had dark rooms which were very cheap and actually very good and ubiquitous film. The camera itself only takes 12 pictures, so it really meant that you had to focus and concentrate on what pictures you wanted to take, which is I think quite different from the experience that we have now. Now my outlook contrasted markedly with the Chinese people I interacted with. Many of them seemed desperate to leave. The West represented a panacea, and foreigners like me were endowed with a wisdom and street smarts which we really didn't possess. But what is clear today is that both for the generation of returning turtles and us, class of 86 China foreigners, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. We can never return except through the 30 or so images I'm about to share with you, which are a small selection of the 800 that I have as an archive. And this one, for instance, I wanted to say that my friend Xiao Chun, who's a barrister and a lawyer in China, a little bit younger than me, but he helped me enormously to actually interpret some of these pictures, because I was just taking pictures, and then he looked at them and said, well, for instance, you'll see that chap's wearing a watch. I said, yeah, okay. He goes, that means he's either got married or he's about to get married. And she'd have a ring, right? And actually, possessions were a big deal. You had to save for those sorts of things. So it's a place of time of kind of Easter and love and all those sorts of things. But they're still not holding hands publicly. And this one, twinned picture in a way. This old couple, I think, has seen almost everything that is possible to be thrown at you. And look at the hands again. They're almost become the same person. And if you look behind, you'll see this gentleman here, and this is the picture of him. And I think it's quite a poignant picture. I think there's a lot of hope, a lot of confidence, but also perhaps a little bit of unease as well about the future. Now, carpenters were still the kind of workmen that you would actually have come into your homes. The old ways, and this could have been dating back even from the Ming Dynasty, was to hire a carpenter who would come in from the countryside, put him up, usually him, up in your hutong for a while whilst you would make your cupboards or whatever, and then he'd go and itinerantly do someone else. And this is actually where the carpenters would be hired from. So they'd come in from the countryside and you'd hire them from there. And this is actually it's on the marble bridge close to the Temple of the Polar Star, which is near the Palace Lake. And that actually could have been a scene from, 400 years before. The hutongs, this is where I actually had my education. This is where I had my Putonghua lessons. They're still very much there. I don't think any of them had been knocked down at that particular point. You could cycle around the back streets. And this one is one of my favorite pictures because it reminds me of a painting by Vermeer, and those that know their Vermeer will know he did several landscapes, one of which has a archway very similar to this. And they're about similar age. I mean, obviously Vermeer was painting in the 18th century. This is probably 17th century. But you know, it's interesting to think all the way from China to Holland, you've got very similar architecture. Now, music wasn't really from radios or cassettes or anything else really. It was live music on the streets. And toys were still being made by hand by itinerant peddlers who would go around. And this guy is making kind of Monkey King style puppets, I guess, out of plasticine. And I actually did a category when I was putting this talk together called Surreal China. And then everything went into Surreal China. Every photograph I seemed to take was bizarrely surreal. But this one, I think, does kind of go with that. And he's actually emerging, I think, from the underground city. And the first time I ever heard anybody speak Putonghua or anything about China, apart from my father who went in around about 1946, was a guy called Peterson, who was from Nigeria. Big, tall guy, and he was in charge of the wood stock that my brother's cooperative building place had in London. And he'd been in China in the 1960s, and he said, Patrick, they're building this city underground in Beijing. And that was very true. And there was a comment from a talk I gave recently about how different the times are now, because it was the Soviets that were the threat, and it was for nuclear fallout shelters in the 60s that the Chinese were building these underground cities. When I was there, you could do a tour. Nowadays, it's a piece of history I think they'd rather forget. So you don't really hear too much about the underground unless somebody falls into it. But it's all a mirror image of the above ground. Street life, actually, as we'll see, China was a bit boring at that time, and there was no TV. Well, there was one TV channel, and it closed at 9. And so a lot of the life was actually on the street. You know, you could play cards, you could, watch life go by. Very different kind of vibe to today. And this is Datong. I think it's the first photograph we have of Datong, apart from the early picture there. And as you can see, it's markedly poorer. I guess that's a very exciting hoop to have, but obviously very different from Beijing, which had city slickers like this. And Xiao Chun tells me that this is the state of the art. You know, this is only in Beijing where you get these wonderful billiards to play. Surveillance was definitely a factor, as it is actually in all societies, but actually it was a little bit less than today, obviously, because there was not electronic surveillance, it was all through people. And I do remember that one time there was a traffic altercation which resulted, this happened quite frequently, and always there were some plainclothes people around with a red armband that would come out and give a summary kind of judgment as to who'd done whatever wrong. This one is a bit more serious. I mean, obviously something's happened with this cyclist here and the police are out, etc. But it was still, again, a very surreal and in a kind of way relaxed. This is actually Zhengguomen Wai. So those that know Beijing quite well will know that it's near the diplomatic quarter, and it's actually impossible to think that such a busy route and such a busy place would have these two goons sitting around. I mean, they almost look like they're in some kind of silent movie, you know. I mentioned earlier that I was teaching English in Beijing Normal University, and these are some of my students. Basically, they would come out and have lessons outside, which was a great thrill. I remember when I first walked into the classroom, and the boys and the girls were heavily segregated each side, and I asked the first boy at the front, and he said his name was Kirk. I said, okay. When I got to the back of the room, they had Klingon. And the teacher before me had actually given them all the names of Star Trek. So we had to scrap that right away. And then I got people to sit in circles, and the boys sat next to the girls. So even if I turned up and I wasn't on form, pretty tired or whatever, they were always on. You know, they were very keen to have, Mr. Pat's lessons. This is a Uyghur student of mine. So one particular time I walked into the classroom and there was 20 Uyghurs sat there, and they only spoke Russian and obviously Putonghua. And so that was a bit of a challenge, since everybody else was pretty fluent in English, and then we had A and B and C here. So it got sorted out. They managed to find a Russian class in the end, but that was an interesting period. They got on really well, actually, and he's actually helping with the lamb casserole that they're about to, the barbecue. So. And there was quite a lot of romance, and I guess students everywhere have a certain amount of romance, and also quite a bit of ambition. Again, you can't really see, but this is a book on calculus, okay? And this chap in 1986 is in Zhongguancun, and those that know technology will know that that is the center of high-tech Silicon Valley for, well, one of the places in China that is. The time I was living there, it was a place of one telephone, which was by an old kind of kiosk, right? One telephone for maybe 5,000 or 6,000 people, and it was always free because nobody else had anybody to ring, right? People with telephones in those days were either the party members or gangsters, right? So, nobody had anybody to ring. This is a professor's room, and I'm struck by the elegance of this picture. I mean, people didn't have a lot in those days, but what they did have, they made as beautiful as they possibly could. And we're going to see a series of photographs around the campus. The joke amongst foreigners at the time was that China, it'll be nice when it's finished. And of course, the idea, we believed, I didn't quite, but some of my colleagues did, that it would never be finished. So these are some of the pictures around Beihai campus. That's actually where my canteen was, around the back there. Now this picture I'm going to pause for a moment on. These guys are having a lunch break, and the kind of cadre is kind of urging them to work harder. And it just shows that there was not a lot going on, because this guy casually stops and listens to this really interesting interchange. They're really, you just grabbed whatever entertainment you could, really. And health and safety wasn't exactly, par for the course. And including for the young photographer, because I can't quite believe that I lay on my back to take this photograph. And it's actually metal girders. It's in northern China, so these aren't bamboo, that would be bad enough, but he's hunking around rather a large piece of metal, and there I am, lying underneath. I actually also went underneath a steam train to take a picture, and stuff like that. We'll see some steam trains as well, so it's probably a miracle I'm still here, really. Washing. I've actually got a thing about washing. I don't know if anybody's a fan of Japanese cinema, but one of my favorite directors is called Ozu. And in all the later films in the 50s and the 60s, 40s as well, you have washing drifting around. And he actually had a really, kind of torrid time, as most people did, up until the 1940s. So I think washing represented to him something about civilization. And if you could get your washing done, then life wasn't quite so bad. But those, again, who know Beijing will know this is almost like St. James's in London. This is the path that is around the side of the Forbidden City. It's historic road. And the idea that you'd hang your washing from it, these days, this is kind of like, that's not going to happen. And also people would wonder about, these are actually from the local hospital. Now, this is Xiao Cheng's favorite picture because it's a very iconic area of Beijing. People have their marriage pictures here quite often. And again, it's not really changed to this day. I think they've repaired the wall a little bit, but the scene is pretty much the same. Now, there was poverty on the streets, and in fact, one of the questions I was asked recently is, did you get any pushback? And I didn't get much pushback when I was using the Seagull camera, but when I was using an SLR and holding it to my eyes, I got a lot of people quite upset. And you know, the refrain was, "You're making China poor." You know, trying to make China look poor and what have you. So I'm afraid to say that this guy is trying to sell his hedgehogs, okay, for people to eat. You know, so there was poverty. And also in Datong, at least, there was no running water in people's houses, and that's why they're collecting the water in the pails. Now, funnily enough, my wife, who's from Hong Kong, remembers doing something similar in 1965, 66, or maybe 67. So Hong Kong also had that period of time, you know, until we had our economic spike. So I'm sure Datong is very different now. And actually, in a way, you know, people had a more leisured time. The idea that you could fish in one of the canals close to the second ring road would be a challenge, I think, today. And actually to have the time and inclination to fish. People seem to have sacrificed a lot of their tranquil time for a hectic life these days. And there was also elegance. I mean, I actually really like this guy's hat. None of it's branded. You know, none of it's, you know, designer or whatever. In fact, they're both wearing pretty cool hats. The other aspect to it is coal. There was an awful lot of coal, and you'll see pictures of coal here, there, and everywhere. And again, this one actually reminds me of Marc Ribot, who was a Magnum photographer, and he took some great photographs, particularly of Shanghai, but also of Datong, which we'll see some more pictures of Datong. But, you know, there's again a certain elegance about people, which is innate, I think. Now this one I'm going to pause for a moment and describe a little bit here, because at the back there's a sign which says, please do not extort, well it doesn't say please, but do not extort your fellow citizens. Do not cheat them, do not shortchange them, do not short measure them. And this is Xinjieko, which was actually, I think, the first free market, and it's actually from this particular time that this happened. So these are guys bringing in whatever they could to sell to citizens. Before that, it had been a command economy. Also indicates there's a certain lack of trust of your fellow citizen, you know, which I think is a result of the Cultural Revolution. And this is actually a municipal scale. So if you were mistrustful of this guy in the corner and his fish, you could actually measure it on a scale that was owned by the government, and therefore you would have a fair idea that it was going to be a fair measure. This guy's holding a catty to measure, I think, water chestnuts. Yeah, so that's a back street in Datong. And also there were electronically powered pandas that would serve you. Actually, I just made that bit up. But maybe I didn't. There's one about to be activated. Now, campus life, go back to, you also had to actually chop every day, and this would be your tea. There you go, a nice chicken for you. And this was the canteen close by the university where we would eat most days. Now, Beijing also had these kind of shops around the front here, and this lady is Baijiu girl. She's selling vodka, you know, the Chinese white spirit. But I want to dwell a moment because, you know, you could also get your bananas there, so you could have a great night. You know, you can have your vodka and you can have your bananas. And I also like this Soviet lampshade, and that was very typical of any hotel you'd stay at or whatever. They have these sort of space age 1950s fittings, which I think are rather cool. Now this is white cabbage, and this is what everybody would be eating during the winter. So this would be autumn Beijing, and then you'd find these white cabbages stacked outside people's apartments, and that would pretty much what you'd eat for 3 months, along with perhaps some pork or whatever to kind of wash it down. Anybody fancy some white cabbage? And we are beginning to see change. So this is the silk market, and at the time it was about 17 stalls. It sold the stuff that Benetton and Levi's had run on, so they weren't exactly counterfeit. They were just, you know, let's run the machine for a little bit longer and then sell them in the silk market, shall we? Everybody who knows Beijing knows the silk market shop now, which is about 8 stories and like an aircraft hangar. That's when it was first beginning. Not too far away either, it's just round the corner from it. Okay. I did say Beijing was a bit boring, and it, I mean, I loved it because I came from a very boring town called Runcorn, so anything was a step up from that. But this is Xuexi, where you'd actually sleep between 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock in the afternoon, partly because I think the nutrition was really not great, so you'd be very tired because you weren't eating as much as you might. But you wouldn't disturb anybody at that time. You know, if they said, "Oh, professor's, on his rest," you knew to leave well alone. Basically, Beijing was closed from about 4. Well, people finished work about 4. Then all the restaurants closed at 6. The TV went off at 9, and so it was a very exciting town, as this picture indicates. Children. Now, again, 1986 was a historic year because in that year it was actually legislated that every child needed to go to school. So, but these kids, as you can see, are actually going to probably go all the way because it's near Beida. They're either Communist Party kids or they're professors' kids. You can see because they're very well kitted out. They've got very nice shoes and the whole thing. And then also you had very feral kids. Somebody observed actually in a talk I gave recently that that's what he really remembered. The kids just running around and doing what they wanted. And again, Cole, I think they've just been released from school. And this one I shot actually from the train going from Datong to Beijing. And there's a slightly Lord of the Flies sinister aspect to this one. I really don't want to comment too much about it.
Is he holding a spear or a shovel?
It looks like he's got I hate to say it, but a shitty stick, doesn't it? A literal shitty stick. Here's looking at you. There you go. There's a certain attitude. And there's another one. What are you looking at? Yeah. You also got kind of unbranded pop, which was a kind of sticky Fanta, Shui it was called, I think, which was pretty gross, but obviously that girl's tucking into it. And then obviously we see the Datong kids again. Now, let's just get a glass of water. There was also quite a bit of mystery and a bit of magic related to China that time. The Yungan Caves, right, and people may know it, it's the 5th, 6th century, one of the first manifestations of Buddhism in China, and they're huge. At that time, on the right-hand side, you could pay a couple of fen and go around the official kind of side. If you went on the left-hand side, you wouldn't know what you'd find because it was kind of just left derelict, okay? And funnily enough, Hedda Morrison took a photograph of Eleanor Roosevelt on top of what I'm about to show you. So there's a kind of historical link to this. Oh, sorry, I've got out of sequence. We'll get to that one in a minute. The other thing that people have forgotten is the fact that Africa and China have been twinned for many, many, many years. And so a lot of my friends at Nankai Daxia were actually African students, and this is taken near the diplomatic embassy in Beijing. So the roots of China's relationship with Africa go way back. And antiques were for sitting on. This is actually a Qing dynasty stele. And obviously the emperor would have some very important things to say about this, that, and the other. And in 1986, it was just a place for students to sit on. Antiques could be thrown away. This is again from the Nagel's Guide. I found this India Buddhist temple in the environs of Beijing, and most of it was kind of by the trash. And I told you I'd get to Taoist temple number Paint Factory 6. And in many ways, I kind of wish I'd kept that. It's such a cool thing, isn't it? But again, probably thrown away. Now this is the bit I referred to earlier, the kind of Indiana Jones China. So you've got Yungan Caves, you've got on this side the official part, and on this side the kind of wild bit. And we had no idea what we were walking into when we first walked in. So this is the first scene. Then you get the idea of the scale, because that's actually a knee, and that's one of the guys who were with us. There was only 3 of us, so one of the guys who was with us. And then that's what we saw. Absolutely enormous. And, just left to sort of sit, really. But that's not the end of it. I did find something that wasn't in Nagel's Guide, which is this. Now imagine, actually the temple and the whole caves are below here. And me and my 2 friends walked up this way. Okay, so we only saw the elevation of it. We thought it was a solid load of, of mud, a bit like an Arizonan kind of terrain, right? So it was only when we walked up that we realized that we were on old city walls, okay? And the whole ancient city, which had obviously been overgrown, was kind of all the way around this way. I still don't know what it is, actually, to be honest. And you can see how big it is because there's a little guy here. So that's a person up there. So it was vast, And that was just a sort of average day where you stumble across an old city. Bikes. We're now on to bikes, trains, and mules and donkeys and stuff. And this was the main way of getting about. And in fact, you see this little lad here with his uncle. This is Datong's main street, and that was the main way of getting about. But when I did the exhibition in the FCC, it was in 2020, right? So kind of a window during COVID where one could meet, around about October time. But nobody from the mainland had actually come across. So the only people that saw the exhibition that were from mainland China were people who were already living here. And there was an oldish, well, my age-ish couple, that bit younger, about 40-ish-year-old couple, who came in to see the exhibition. And he said to me, the guy said, actually my Phoenix bike from Shanghai was my babe magnet, And she said, yes, it was, because that's why she went out with him and married him, right? So bikes were a huge thing, and there's a few pictures of bikes here, right? So he's, got his bike, please, hi, want to ride? And this guy's incredibly proud of his bike, and there it is. And I did promise a picture of Beijing Underground, and the reason I wanted to talk about this for a moment is that what had happened was that Mao in the 50s had made, I think he made 2 historic visits to Moscow, and that was about it. That was as much of a foreign travel as he made. And Stalin, in the first period of time, made him wait around for quite a long time. So he got quite familiar with the Moscow Underground. He came back and he said, I want an underground to rival Stalin's. And then he went back and did whatever he was doing. And these poor cadres looked at each other and said, well, there's no budget. What do we do? And so they decided to drop the underground into the moat of the old city. Okay? And that had a catastrophic effect. Got them out of trouble, I guess. But also, if you imagine from the 13th century, they'd actually had this water system which came from the hills around the heart, if you like, of the Forbidden City and then towards the ocean. And by stopping that moat and that, they destroyed the whole ecosystem of Beijing. And that's one of the reasons it's so dry today. So if you're next time on the Beijing Underground, have a think about that. And these are the trains. I didn't go underneath this one, I don't think, but one very similar. They were still being made in Datong at the time of '86. I think it was a few years later that they actually stopped manufacturing them. Oh, and this one. The reason I call this Goodbye Mummy is that Zhao Ziyang, the premier of the time, had actually just opened up the cities on the coast to have joint ventures. And so as a consequence, women from the provinces would be going to these cities, nimble-handed. And so there was a kind of exodus of these folk. And of course they would leave behind a baby and their husband. So, and the trains were the main artery through which that kind of migration to the cities and to the, new prosperity was happening. And they were a lot better than the provincial buses, which I think were probably quite a strain. Okay, we've got some other pictures of donkey carts and what have you. They actually went right into the middle of Beijing at the time, so you'd have these sorts of sites quite regularly. There's a guy just waking up. And then inevitably you'd always be waiting for a bus. 302, I didn't have a lot of money, so buses were the main way of getting around until I could afford my own Seagull camera, my own Phoenix bicycle. What did we look like? What did foreigners like us look like? I think as if we were dropped from Mars. Okay, so this is what Beishada looks like today. So China did get finished, and this is what Beijing, actually a friend on the table asked me when was the last time I was in Beijing. That was in 2019, and you can see the surveillance cameras and a very different feel to the whole city. Now, if you don't mind, indulge me just for a moment, because I want to talk very briefly about photography and art and how art and photography are twinned. Let me just get to my comments here. So, firstly, what distinguishes photography as an art form? Well, for Henri Cartier-Bresson, it is its ability to capture a single moment. He believed that photographers deal in things which are continually vanishing, and when they are vanished, there is no contrivance on earth which will make them come back again. But through capturing a vanishing moment, some photographs do achieve a certain timelessness. As to how they do that, they're actually indebted to paintings from the Renaissance onwards. So if we look at this, basically what's going on is that if we deconstruct Darton Boys, it's a basic pictorial element, it's a monofocal image constructed around a single triangle that stretches to an infinite point. And this is also true for Piero della Francesca's Resurrection. For Piero della Francesca, there's something else going on. He wants to express an eternal moment through this pictorial construction. To paraphrase Elena Ferrante, between the photograph that the artist took and the photograph that the viewer sees, there is a third photograph. This third photograph, elusive, changing, is nevertheless a real photograph. I didn't actually take it, my viewers haven't actually seen it, but it's there. It's the photograph that is created in the relationship between life and looking. But as Piero della Francesca intimately knew, all images, all art, falls short of perfection. Between the idea and reality falls the shadow. Thank you very much. So, I'm happy to take questions.
Which one of those is your favorite picture?
I think actually Billiard Girl. Darton Boys, I think also, but Billiard Girl has got, she's having a lot of fun at the expense of those boys somehow. I'm not quite sure why, but there's something going on.
Thank you for the presentation, it's very interesting. How are your photographs received in the mainland these days?
Well, they haven't really been. I actually wanted to hold this exhibition in 2020, and I had made some approaches, but obviously a lot of things got in the way. There's a lot more important things than my exhibition of photographs happening. So they haven't really been shown in the mainland. When I gave a talk in Oxford in March, it was the Confucian Institute, which is part of Oxford Brookes University. A number of the younger Chinese students came along to it, and they were thrilled. They said, "Oh, this is like my grandfather's." I didn't feel terribly flattered by that, but our grandfather's time and all the rest of it. But also, I think they saw something of a world that they hadn't seen. I guess if one were to make a parallel, my parents were brought up in the 30s and the 40s, and I'm not sure how they would have reacted to photographs of a time of relative poverty in the UK. Obviously quite mixed, but you wouldn't necessarily want to buy the book, you know? So I guess there's something related to that. But I'd love to do an exhibition in China. I think the time will come. Might not be now, but the time will come.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. The film that you were using was a 35 mm.
No, it was 120. That's a good girl.
So you developed it in China, or you developed outside China?
It developed in China. I couldn't afford to develop it in England. No, so there was quite a number of quite good darkroom places, which are one just off Fujing, and so you just drop the films off and then you get them. A couple of reasons why it's taken me a while to do this is the fact that they were rolled up in a kind of shoebox, you know, and it required the kids going to UK for school and other things. So we had a bit of time, and also a very nice guy called Mr. Liang in Wanchai, who straightened them and scanned them. So there's a couple of things going on. But there's about 800 pictures altogether.
Back towards the middle, I may have missed your explanation, but there was a picture where the caption was the Edith Piaf of Beijing, I think it was.
Yeah.
Could you explain why that was? Is it just similar to a famous photo of her, or was this person actually?
No, it wasn't Edith Piaf. I wish it was. That would be the great story, wouldn't it? You know, it really would be. One part I skipped actually was also about meeting one of Puyi's relatives. The half-brother of Puyi, I was wandering about as I do, and I did, and I walked around the back of a pavilion where I'd been hanging out, taking, actually painting. I like painting, and I was taken to something that looked like something from the, the Story of the Stone or something, And there he was with his sister doing calligraphy, and it was a German-speaking chap who had this earphone that said, "Come this way." It was because I was obviously unofficial. I think they probably were thinking maybe this is a conduit where we could get our story out or something. But yes, very surreal things happening. The reason I think that I called that Edith Piaf is because it echoes a photograph by Marc Ribot in Shanghai, and a lot of these, there's a place called the Creek, Suzhou Creek, which people may know, and a lot of the kind of artistic community of Shanghai were living in Suzhou Creek, and so he took some fantastic pictures of these people who'd been, kind of singers or, opera people or whatever, and it echoes that, I think. Yeah, thank you.
Patrick, you showed a photograph of a lady, a Western lady with the two babies in sort of mother care pram. It's almost as if it was done today. But how many foreigners were there, and were they sort of quite modern, or how was the approach?
So Paul, that's an interesting question, because I was a bit of an oddity, because I'd gone out to follow my girlfriend at the time. We'd met in the third year of Leeds University, but she was studying Chinese and English, so she went out on a scholarship, and I worked in a mill to get the money to go and join her in December. So I wasn't part of any official group. I mean, there was going to be voluntary service people overseas or whatever, so I was not at any university or whatever, and I ended up living with a Chinese family in Beida, that area. So my interaction with foreigners was actually quite limited, and quite glad actually, because I did learn some Putonghua, and I also took these photographs. I wasn't on a kind of program with everybody else, but there were, a few. I mean, it was a very exciting time to be a foreigner there, because every other day it seemed a new part of China was being opened up in the 1982, 83, and suddenly you could go to places which you'd probably be the only foreigner to have been for quite some time. So it was a very interesting time. There wasn't a lot of foreigners. As I say, China wasn't a magnet for making money at that particular point. So there were people with particular agendas that were going,
Wandering around Beijing in 1986 with a camera, were you considered a potential spy, and were you followed at all?
No, but it's a good question, because in the 50s and the 60s, there's a very famous American chap who took a photograph with, obviously a camera like this, but took a photograph close to the harbour in Shanghai and ended up being in jail for a long time. I think that's why I was very lucky, because 86, so that he was in jail for over a year, and he wrote Prisoner of Shanghai, I think the story is called, and how they subjected him to thought reform and all the rest of it. My boss at Newsweek, a guy called Jim Pringle, basically had replaced a Mr. Gray, who people will know had been, I think he was with Reuters, right, Gray? He'd been under house arrest. So you can imagine how that conversation would go. Jim, we'd like you to go to Beijing, and your predecessor has been under house arrest for the last 3 years. So it was a very special time, though, and I think the camera helped because it's fairly innocent sort of looking thing,
and obvious because it's so big.
That's right. Yeah. Right. Well.
Do you consider to come back to Beijing and take the same picture with a color picture and same spot? Will be interesting contrast. So speaking from my perspective, I'm from Beijing and was born in 1987. So literally that's my childhood. And all the xinjiekong, all the sweet potato, all the winter cabbage, that's exactly my childhood. But things are changing so dramatically over the past 30 years. It would be nice to see some contrast.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a blog that I subscribe to called London Heritage, and this guy who's a bit older than me, but his father took photographs of London, and basically he then revisits where his father took these pictures and says what's happened and the history of those areas. So it would be a fun project, you know, for sure.
Charles mission.
Yeah, and probably get arrested, but there we go. Okay. Any?
The ingredients.
Sure, no, please.
You have taken the picture in the Forbidden City.
Yeah, I've actually got an interesting story about that. Very briefly, I know people have got work or stuff or whatever, but anyway, one of my mentors is a chap called Tong Lam, Geshe Tong Lam, who is a much better photographer than I am. And we went around the Forbidden City together taking pictures. And there's a few, this is much later, this is in the 90s, and using a Zenith, sorry, not a Zenith, a Leica camera. Mao never went into the Forbidden City. He was told that if he did, he would lose his power, right? So he never went in. And it's a really odd thing to think that for the symbol, and I met the person who'd actually made the symbol of China, and you know, it is the Forbidden City with the stars behind. I think we all know it, right? It's so ubiquitous. I met the guy who actually created that icon, and I wish I'd met him later, because I never asked him the obvious question as to why a communist symbol would have the equivalent of Versailles on it. I mean, it's very odd as you think about it, isn't it? You know. But with the Forbidden City, what's quite interesting is that the Qing dynasty were a Buddhist thing, and Tong Lam pointed out that the kind of the character above the head of the emperor, as he would be seeing all the people in you know the foreigners coming and paying homage, was emptiness. Very interesting.
So this isn't about photography, you might not know the answer. But I wonder, given the Cultural Revolution, given all of the things that were pulled down and destroyed, including the city wall, which I think now some people have actually publicly said is a mistake, how was it that the Forbidden City was preserved in all of its glory?
To be rented out to Bertolucci about that time, maybe. It was so vast. I mean, actually, the Forbidden City is quite an anomaly, because the last time that I went there, it was still incredibly dusty and not really very exciting as a place to visit, right? And I think that's almost deliberate, because you don't want to play up, you know, the imperial time, you know. But I think it was so big that you couldn't do much with it. I mean, you know, China was actually extremely poor at that particular time. So to refurbish something or to do something else. I mean, of course, Tiananmen Square itself, up until the late 40s, had been absolutely populated with small wooden buildings, right? I mean, it was awash with small kind of almost temporary buildings. They were swept aside, I think before the communists, you know, took over in '49, but that was fairly recent. The wall was taken down in the early 50s. I'm not quite sure why, but they took the wall down, probably perhaps to use the stone or something, I'm not sure. But Beijing's an odd city anyway. I mean, it's only there because it was a northern group that actually occupied China. So it's not got any rivers or any lakes or anything to differentiate it. It's a defensive place because of the north, you know.
I know what's your feeling now when you look back to the journey you started decades ago, and what's your plan to carry forward on this journey?
Okay, so what's my feeling now?
Yeah, when you look back to those decades ago.
I'm a bit tired, actually, because I think, how did I manage to take 800 pictures, you know, and every time, you know, change the film without a light meter or anything else like that? I'd be staggered to try and do that today, to be honest, you know. I still take photographs. You still use film, you know, I still go to, I think anybody who's actually really keen to develop an artistic sense as a photographer needs to regularly go to exhibitions to keep their eye in. So I live in Abu Dhabi and they've got the Louvre, which has got fabulous stuff. So yeah, still working hard, you know. Okay, so thank you very much. Okay.